It's afternoon here in Providence. Very gloomy, very rainy. I hope you're someplace beautiful, and I certainly hope that you are safe and well. This is the 13th week of lectures. I'm amazed at how devotedly you have managed to follow my talking like a piece of wood. Um, and whatever is going on in the outside world, I think I admire you all for doing such good work under these circumstances. Please, if anybody is in any kind of distress or worry about the class, I have heard directly by email from some of you. Obviously, I've not been able to get the Zoom office hours to work properly. Please get in touch with me or with Young Bali. And it doesn't really even have to be about this course. Although if it's not about this course, probably better to talk to me. And I will do everything that I can to help you. This is our last text in Tales and Talemakers, and it brings us right up to the 18th century. So while it invokes antiquity, if you've started the book, if you've taken a look at the first chapter, please don't panic. If you can get through the first chapter, the novel will actually, or the novel as you will prefer to understand it, will actually start. So don't panic. It's going to happen, but chapter 1 is really extremely strange. It is, in its entirety, a very long book. It's actually even longer than The Journey to the West or Three Kingdoms. And it is masterfully translated in 5 volumes by David Hawkes and his son-in-law, John Minford. It's really a brilliant translation. We are certainly not going to see anything better in my lifetime. But people, because of the size of the book and its complexity, spend, if they happen to fall into it, and I have, spend a good deal of time reading and studying this book. And I have been reading and studying this book now for almost 40 years. I have written 2 books about interpreting this book and understanding this book, aimed at a non-Chinese speaking audience so that they can enjoy the translation, but also using methodology and bringing ideas to bear on the text that are useful to Chinese readers and Chinese specialists. But in the context of this course, we are finally dealing with a full-length work of true fiction. But let me first compare The Story of the Stone, otherwise known as The Dream of the Red Chamber, with 2 other Chinese works of prose fiction that we have studied, namely Three Kingdoms and Monkey. Now, Three Kingdoms and Monkey are both based, although it may be difficult to remember, especially in the case of Monkey, on historical events and personages. Three Kingdoms, as you remember, comes from a work of historiography, an account of the wars which accompanied the fall of the Han Dynasty. The history of the period of division of China into 3 kingdoms lasted from roughly 221 to 419, counting in the Christian era. The novel deals with the first stage of this period of chaos, focusing on the major leaders of the contending factions, all of whom were historical personages, and particularly the author fell in love with the figure of Zhuge Liang, or Kongming. And before the novel was published at the end of the 14th century, he was known as a statesman and a strategist, but it's the novelist's characterization and presentation of the character which portrays him as the great hero of the Three Kingdoms conflict, the one who chose to serve his prince loyally when he himself might have been able to take the power. And because of his loyalty to this fallible prince, the cause of the Han, or the kingdom of Shu, was lost, and the one portrayed here as a villain, Cao Cao, gained the triumph. In the historiography, the heroism, or the good guys versus the bad guys, obviously this is not as emphasized. Now, Monkey is based on the accounts of a journey by a Tang Buddhist pilgrim, whom we call Tripitaka, who set out in 629 for India. He returned nearly 17 years later, in 645, this is in the early Tang dynasty, with an enormous load of Buddhist texts, 657 to be precise. And once he got back to the capital of Chang'an, he was set up in the White Horse Monastery, and he spent the rest of his life translating these texts and transmitting their teachings. While he wrote an autobiographical account of his journey, which is preserved to this day, and which, for my sins, I have actually read, but that was a long time ago, and as it says in Airplane, and that's not important right now. The popular account of this extraordinary enterprise had much more vitality than the historical narrative. Many legends, including the ones that brought in the magical helpers, the miracles, which are so essential to the version we read, to say nothing of the colorful depiction of the challenges that the pilgrims must face during their journey. That's all been added, and by the time the novel that you've read part of, in the form of Monkey, was compiled in the 16th century, they'd had 1,000 years almost to add things together, and this is China's most beloved book. Here's another thing. So all these historical figures, while they have their weaknesses and are even subject to satire, are still basically heroic in conception by our standards, right? Somehow they are larger than life, they operate in a realm beyond our experience, and this is not just because the setting is so foreign to us. So we have heroes with almost superhuman endowments. Here's another thing, number 3. All of these heroes have a cause. The restoration of the Han dynasty, or the foundation of a new dynasty, depending on which camp you're in, that is the purpose of Three Kingdoms. That's what animates the heroes. That's what inspires the swearing of the Peach Garden Oath, and so on and so forth. In the case of Monkey, of course, it's pursuit of personal spiritual enlightenment. And secondarily, the results of the pilgrimage are aimed at the greater good of the community because of the emphasis on bringing back the scriptures to China. So both novels, both in Three Kingdoms and The Journey to the West, or Monkey, there is a greater commitment or quest than just a search for individual fulfillment involved. Another thing that's occurred to me is that both texts are pretty violent, even by Homer's standards. While the violence may be undercut by irony or removed to a fantastical context, I mean, when Monkey is flying through the air and battling with, the god Arlong and so on and so forth, or being smelted in Lao-Tzu's brazier and so on and so forth. I guess it's not a brazier, it must be some kind of a smelter. But anyway, it's pretty violent. And its explicit description is meant as a statement on the moral situation of the text. Now, the author of The Story of the Stone, which is better known as The Dream of the Red Chamber, Hong Lou Meng in Chinese, departs from the world of history and legend to treat a world of the author's own creation. In the author's introduction, Cao She-Qin declares that he writes of his nostalgia for the lovely girls, mostly in his own extended family, that he knew as a boy, and he wishes to record their lives and his regrets for their sad fates. And in so doing, it is assumed by critics of Chinese literature that the material is, he may be tracing a lot of his own life, especially his childhood. And I can read you this passage from the introduction. I highly recommend this introduction. By the way, David Hawkes does a very good job of explaining the major issues involved in the authorship and history of this novel. And this is page 20 of the introduction. Okay. Having made an utter failure of my life, I found myself one day in the midst of my poverty and wretchedness, thinking about the female companions of my youth. As I went over them one by one, examining and comparing them in my mind's eye, it suddenly came over me that those slips of girls, which is all they were then, were in every way, both morally and intellectually, superior to the grave and mustachioed signora I am now supposed to have become. The realization brought with it an overpowering sense of shame and remorse, and for a while I was plunged into the deepest despair. There and then I resolved to make a record of all the recollections of those days that I could muster, those golden days when I dressed in silk and ate delicately, when we still nestled in the protecting shadow of the ancestors and heaven still smiled upon us. I resolved to tell the world how, in defiance of all my family's warnings and the advice of my friends, I have brought myself to this present wretched state in which, having frittered away half a lifetime, I find myself without a single skill with which I could earn a decent living. I resolved that, however unsightly my own shortcomings might be, I must not, for the sake of keeping them hid, allow those wonderful girls to pass into oblivion without a memorial. This was written by the author himself. It was in a letter to a cousin of his, and indeed, like Sima Chen, somehow these fragmentary pieces of correspondence reaching to us from across the centuries can provide a real shock of recognition of the personality to the reader. Also, it shows that he is going to emphasize female and feminine experience in this novel, which of course is another aspect of its originality and the astonishing timelessness and being ahead of his time of the author. Whatever the autobiographical significance of the main body of the story, Cao Xueqin sets up a household of the Jias, Bao Yu's parents and their extended family, as a microcosm of Chinese society and tests all the ideals of traditional Chinese culture in this context. And the book that I have already published about this is actually called Ideal and Actual in the Story of the Stone, dealing with how the author juxtaposes our ideal patterns with our actual patterns. That's a theme that's run through the whole course. Now, one of the important aspects of Chinese society examined is, of course, the conflicting attitudes toward and demands of romantic and sexual love. Bao Yu, the protagonist and hero, favors romance, which does not have much place in traditional Confucian, traditional Taoist, and traditional Buddhist teachings. Confucius and Confucianism teaches values that elevate the familial aspects of married love, but deplores both sexual indulgence and romantic obsession, as they are seen to interfere with a man's primary duty to use his talents to serve the state and his family. In other words, deplorable distractions. In the ideals of Taoism or Buddhism at this time, as we know from Monkey, one must liberate oneself from all earthly attachments in order to achieve spiritual enlightenment. And these attachments include romantic and sexual love. Bao Yu struggles with these conflicts throughout the tale, and while his decision at the end to become a monk, sorry, spoiler alert, but that's 2,000 pages on, okay? His decision at the end of the narrative to become a monk and leave the world, this decision seems to emphasize individual liberation. However, throughout the narrative, as you can see even just in the first parts of the first volume that you're going to read, the Confucian ideals of domesticity and stability are by no means rejected, and so this ambiguity is fundamental to the society which produced our hero. One of the minor figures in the novel, a distant relative of Bao Yu's named Zhao Yuzun, who appears in the first chapter, places Bao Yu among those unusual men and women in Chinese history who seem to be gifted or cursed with a peculiar vitality which is neither good nor evil in itself, but may incline the individual to either. And here, let me read from page 78. This is kind of a wonderful discussion in chapter 2, but you may find it quite difficult to follow. There are a lot of names involved, and also you may find it just downright boring. But basically, Zhao Yuzun, whose name is a pun that translates very nicely as false discourse, not false news, not fake news, false discourse. He is having a discussion with an old friend who is attached by marriage to one of the domestics in the Jia household. And they are having a really highfalutin philosophical conversation about how human character is it nature or nurture? And Zhao Yuzun sees it very much as natural endowment. Okay, so long discussion about how the good and bad humors meet in a way that causes them to be in conflict. The two will become locked, that's good and bad humors, in irreconcilable conflict, the good refusing to yield to the evil persisting in its hatred of the good. And just as wind, water, thunder, and lightning meeting over the earth can neither dissipate nor yield one to another, but produce an explosive shock resulting in the downward emission of rain, so does this clash of humors, which, being thus forced downwards, will find its way into some human creature. Such human recipients, whether they be male or female, since they are already amply endowed with the benign humor before the evil humor is injected, are incapable of becoming either greatly good or wholly bad. But place them in the company of 10,000 others, and you will find they are superior to all the rest in sharpness and intelligence, and inferior to all the rest in perversity, wrong-headedness, and eccentricity. Born into a rich and noble household, they are likely to become great lovers, or the occasion of great love in others. In a poor but well-educated household, they will become literary rebels or eccentric aesthetes. Even if they are born in the lowest stratum of society, they are likely to become great actors or famous satiroi. Under no circumstances will you find them in servile or menial positions, content to be at the beck and call of mediocrities. And then he gives a list of people, famous artists mostly, from Chinese history, who seem to exemplify this strange recipient of humors. Now, we have creatures like this in the West also. Individuals like Helen of Troy or Electra or Oedipus, who seem to have been born to cause a ruckus no matter what they do in spite of themselves. Of course, in Greco-Roman mythology, this is very much a matter of fate. And it is also in the West often related to the notion of the divine. But here we have a very different explanation of the hero's origin, because he's a rock. Remember? First couple of pages of chapter 1? He's the rock left over from the goddess Nua's repairs of the sky. What? What do you mean he's a rock? Well, one of my favorite reminiscences from graduate school was members of, the group of graduate students who were pretty close. And my apartment fortuitously had a very large living room, and I had a couch. So we would often get together and, shoot the breeze, obviously. But we were fascinated with Monty Python, which usually showed on Saturday nights, and we would watch that. And then they had the Summarized Proust contest. Now, what's the Summarized Proust contest? Well, Proust was the author of the great 20th century modernist novel, Remembrance of Things Past, also translated, but I think less successfully, as In Search of Lost Time. And it's one of these multi-volume things. It's enormous. And in the Monty Python sketches, they had teams from all over Great Britain, of course, and But the emphasis was on the strange diversity of the teams and not their ability to summarize Proust. So we thought, well, we could probably do better, and you had to do it in 45 seconds or less. So we had a winner. In fact, it was my first encounter with the peculiar creativity of Brown graduates. She was a Brown graduate, and she won with this entry. Remembrance of Things Past is a very long French book about a man who falls in love with a cookie. Riffing on Shiro Wolosky's brilliant summary of Proust, I would like to tell you that The Story of the Stone is a very long Chinese book about a rock who falls in love with a flower. Because if you read in the first chapter, you find that the reason for the stone's incarnation as the human boy, Bao Yu, is because he has fallen into romantic longing for the crimson pearl flower, and they can only be disillusioned from the romance by undergoing a rebirth as mortals and living a mortal life to reach enlightenment. In the case of the crimson pearl flower, she is incarnated as the love of Bao Yu's life, namely his cousin Lin Dai Yu. And this is because she, feeling guilty about the stones watering her with this special dew that has given her life as a fairy instead of as a vegetable or a vegetable creature, she decides that the only way she can repay him is to undergo a lifetime shedding tears over him to the precise amount that he has used to bring her to life. And that has to be her penance. But that's not important right now. Bao Yu is marked from his birth as special. But his jade, the jade with which he is born, is only a symbol of his fated self. This special child, whose jade symbolizes his spiritual essence, needs no supernatural connections at all to find himself in a peculiar situation, one that can definitely produce a blockbuster novel. He is the only son and all the hope of a declining household, and we would certainly have plenty of material for a blockbuster psychological novel without the allegorical structure and significance of chapter 1. Now, let's see. Even without the scene in the land of illusion from chapter 1, Bao Yu's world gives us an even more palpable sense of the essential artificiality of human existence than the tale of Genji. The Garden of Total Vision, that's my advisor's translation of Prospect Garden, really expands to fill the universe, or at least the empire. After the context of the Land of Illusion, Prospect Garden becomes the frame of the story of the stone. And the term for prospect or for total vision in the garden's name is Daguanyuan. Daguan means large view, but it's also a Buddhist term, which means total vision, in the sense of when you become enlightenment, you understand everything simultaneously, and therefore you can see through the futility of attachment to at least emotional existence. All right. Within the context of the narrative frame, the plot obviously centers on Bao Yu's relations with the females in his household. Quick and dirty synopsis of the symbolic value of Chapter 1. The stone of spiritual understanding traverses the world of experience to gain enlightenment, and that is the reason that the first title of the manuscript was The Story of the Stone. Now that's for the whole novel. It's secondary to A Rock Who Falls in Love with a Flower. Now, this is, in the first chapter, a Buddhist answer to the complexities of the plot. We have the stone, the only stone left over from repairing the hole in the sky, because part of the sky fell down when something, we don't know what, hit one of the 4 pillars on the back of the tortoise on which the earth rests. And the pillar buckled, the earth tilted, which explains the earth's tilt on its axis. I told you the story of Yu, who was the tamer of the flood in Chinese mythology. And when the earth tilted, the sky also tilted, and some of it fell down. So it had to be repaired. That's the very first part of the first chapter. And for some reason, he is left out because she doesn't need it. She only needs how many? It says right here on the first page of chapter 1. 36,500 blocks, but she's made 36,501. I would have done the same thing. You know, if I'm making cookies or I always want extra to make sure there's enough. But now this block of stone, having undergone the melting and molding of a goddess, possessed magic powers. It could move about at will and could grow or shrink to any size it wanted. Observing that all the other blocks had been used for celestial repairs, and it was the only one to have been rejected as unworthy, it became filled with shame and resentment, and passed its days in sorrow and lamentation. Now, this is the land of illusion, but it's a rock. And he meets a Buddhist and a Taoist who are obviously enlightened and magical human. Well, I don't know if they're human. They must have been human beings. Creatures. Let's just call them magical and enlightened creatures. And they arrange for his incarnation as a human being. And then, so in other words, the stone starts off at the point of emptiness, because that's what the land of illusion is. He wishes, because of his dissatisfaction, to belong to the world of illusion. That's our world of the red dust. And from this desire, he finds the means of joining the world. He bumps into the Buddhist and the Taoist, and they say they can fix this up for him. And human feelings and attachments arise in him, in his person as Bao Yu. And from his experiences in the world of illusion, he reaches enlightenment as to the true meaning of emptiness and finally abandons the world. This takes 120 chapters. So this is, in fact, the story of the stone. And Brother Amor, who starts out as the flying Taoist Vanitas, merely by reading the account written on the stone, actually experiences the same process and reaches enlightenment, which means that you can too. In other words, if this is the text that was written on the stone, then this text, having been written down exactly as it happened, accurately reflects Bao Yu's experience in the human world, and therefore precisely records all of the experience he had to undergo to reach enlightenment. And therefore, if you read the text carefully, I assume, you too can follow his process and reach enlightenment. This is how it works. After Vanitas reads the text, here's page 51, as a consequence of all this, Vanitas, starting out in the void, which is truth, came to the contemplation of form, which is illusion, and from form engendered passion, and by communicating passion, entered again into form, and from form awoke to the void, which is truth. He therefore changed his name from Vanitas to Brother Amor, or the passionate monk, because he had approached truth by way of passion, and changed the title of the book from The Story of the Stone to The Tale of Brother Amor. And then the next paragraph goes through a couple of other possible, couple of other additions and titles. I love the egotism of Brother Amor, who, once he has possessed the text, changes the title to reflect his experience rather than the stone's. I tried to paraphrase the process in this way. The reader, that's you or me, starting off in the void, that is to say before opening the book, comes to the contemplation of form, the fictional world of the novel, because you've opened it and started to read it and maybe even gotten involved. And from form engenders passion. You become attached to the fictional characters. And by communicating passion, becoming deeply involved in their lives, you enter again into form, realizing this is nothing but fiction, not real, and from form, awake to the void, realizing that attachment to one's own reality is just as deluded as attachment to the stone's world, and so achieving release. Did you get it? Did you achieve release? Did you... theoretically, one should be able to get it in the first chapter, then you don't even have to read the rest of the book. As I told you, I have been studying this book for nearly 40 years, and I am still here. So please don't get distressed if you worry that if you haven't gotten it the first time around. Okay, and as a matter of fact, once you once Brother Amor is out of the scene, you forget all about this and become involved with characters like Jun Shi-in, who is Jia Yutsun's patron and good friend. And it may interest you to hear that as Jia Yutsun's name is a pun for false discourse, Jia, which is the name of the family in the Story of the Stone, or the main family, is a homophone for the word that means false. Zhen, in the name of Zhen Shi-in, is a homophone for the word that means true. And so in the case of Zhen Shi-in, it's basically a pun for allegory. It means truth lies hidden. And when truth lies hidden starts to patronize false discourse, well, strange things can happen. That is probably about enough for today. You are probably totally confused, and I apologize for that. But the important thing is, if you're having difficulty in Chapter 1, you are by no means alone. So please don't worry about it. And just once you pick up the thread of Zhen Shi-in, the kidnapping of Zhen Shi-in's daughter, the success of Jia Yutsun, who has been given the patronage of Zhen Shi-in, the calamities that Zhen Shi-in has in his life, and his enlightenment. Well, gee, I guess we still have an awful lot to talk about. I will try to talk about specific episodes in the next lecture. Take care, stay well, and thank you for listening.